Welcome to episode 126 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Killorn in waterlogged Napa Valley.
Waterlogged Napa Valley. Is the place soaked? Do you feel waterlogged? How
I'm
goes
good.
it?
Napa Valley is very soaked. All of Northern California is. I, fortunately, am on high ground, so I'm fine.
Oh, that's good. You can start building that ark.
I'm not the guy for that.
No, I know. I know you're not.
I'll watch them sail off while I have a drink in hand.
Well, that's a nice transition. What do you have in hand at the moment?
Actually, I've got a glass of Syrah. This is a 2018 Albin Syrah. It's a imprint they call Patrina, which is really good. And John Albin's a guy I've met before. He's kind of a character, but he's a great winemaker. And if you like Syrah, this is a great one. But it's not an apple wine, so a little bit anti my homeland here.
That's okay. It's good to kind of spread your reach. I, on the other hand, I'm doing a dry January, so I'm just having beer. I feel like beer and wine for a dry January is about the John way to do it. No liquor this month. Specifically, though, I've got a great Hawaiian beer, a Kona Big Wave Ale. If anybody listening out there hasn't had this, I recommend it. It's refreshing.
I'm familiar with it, actually. However, this is not the definition of dry January, John.
Oh, suddenly you're a doctor?
No, I'm a person who understands the meaning of words. And that's not what dry January means.
Tomato.
No, it's not what it is. Let's just say you're drinking less in January. Isn't that not a dry January?
I cut out whiskey and tequila. Give me some credit.
I give you credit for that 100%, but then don't make a larger claim.
All right, fair enough. I'm having a damp January, I think is what I'm having.
Okay, I can live with that. See, that actually makes a lot more sense to me. I might use that in the future.
Fair enough.
Probably not, but who knows?
Well, on a less fun note, the song we have picked today, and it's funny where we often get the song inspirations, they tend to come from one of like three places. They're either very relevant to the topic at hand, what we're discussing. They're something that you or I have just found interesting and have been listening to. Or they tend to mark some sort of like milestone, in this case, something of a sad one. One of the greatest guitarists of all time, Jeff Beck, died about a week ago. So we decided to pay a little tribute to Jeff Beck with a song by his old band, the Yardbirds, today. I know you're really familiar with Jeff Beck and that era of music as well.
I am.
Yeah, he's one of the greats, man. Part of that kind of like British wave, basically, of just heroes that came through. Clapton and the Beatles and the Stones, all those guys at the same time.
And all those bands hanging out in London, just trading players left and right.
Yeah. So for anyone unfamiliar with the Yardbirds, Clapton was the guitarist in this band originally, felt they were a little too commercial, and so they decided they would replace him, or he quit and got replaced by not just Jeff Beck, but also Jimmy Page, who then went on to found, of course, Led Zeppelin.
And didn't we, isn't Ronnie Wood somewhere in there as well, like of the Rolling Stones?
Yeah, Stones guy. In fact, I think Jeff Beck turned down an invitation to be the guitarist in the Stones. I don't know if he was going to play with Keith, or if Keith came along after. But yeah.
It's really interesting. Like if you study that era of music, you find that guys like Ronnie Wood, they were playing with Rod Stewart for a while. Mm-hmm. And then they end up in the Rolling Stones, just moving around from like great act to great act. Obviously, I wasn't alive or in London at that particular point, but that would have been an awesome era to be a part of, because I think that was a lot of fun, and the music every night must have just been insane.
Oh man, yeah, that's definitely on my time machine list if we could do it. In fact, Beck and Rod Stewart recorded a couple albums together, I think, or at least had some songs. I think what you might be thinking about, there's a song, it might be called Beck's Bolero, or maybe Freeway Jam, where Beck, Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, the bassist of Led Zeppelin, and Ron Wood all played on this one track together. So pretty crazy.
It's kind of weak lineup, honestly.
Yeah. I think I'd pay a cover to see that.
Okay, so it's a pretty great lineup.
But the song that we picked, I think, was like the first Yardbirds hit, called Heart Full of Soul is the song. If anybody wants a flashback to some 60s rock, there you go.
Yeah, and he's a great guitarist, really interesting character as well. But that's not what we're here to talk about as much as I enjoy talking about it. Let's talk about the LSAT, and we're overall here to talk about the January 2023 exam, which has just finished up this week. But we're going to start with just a little bit of an update on the LSAT world in general before we jump into that conversation about the specifics of this January test.
Yeah.
So, John, you want to run some details for us there?
Yeah, and we have quite a few details. In fact, I guess the most urgent or the most recent thing that's about to happen is there's a makeup test being offered for the January people next Wednesday. That's January 25th. They do this for every LSAT. For those unfamiliar, there's always a retake option of makeup offered for people who had some sort of maybe a tech issue, some proctor issue, a glitch that happened that didn't allow them to complete their original exam as planned or as intended. LSAC has this safety net of sorts. It's always the week after the test, but that'll be next Wednesday. If you've registered for that, it'll be a different set of content than what we're going to talk about today. So unfortunately, today is not your like cheat code or shortcut. You don't get a preview. It'll be a completely different test than what you saw and what we talk about. But that will happen next Wednesday. And then, of course, about 3 weeks from today, we move right into the February LSAT. If you haven't registered for that already, I'm sorry to say the registration is passed. That was December 27th. But if you are registered, that test is going to start on February 10th, which is a Friday. And just like this January test, it'll run Friday and Saturday all day, some tests into the next week for accommodations and things. And there'll be a makeup for that as well. The score release for the February test is going to be March 1st, bright and early Eastern time. It'll start about 9 a.m. that morning. So those are the next sets, I suppose, of test days coming up.
Yeah, definitely the February test date. And then that score release for the February exam is on March 1st.
Mm-hmm.
That's the day before the April LSAT registration actually closes. So there's no March LSAT this year. There's January, February, and then April. But on March 2nd, so you have about a day if you take that February test to decide whether or not you want to take April. And then the April test starts Friday, April 14th, and runs on the 14th and 15th. And then scores from that exam come out in May, on May 3rd. And these LSATs, certainly January is used at all schools. A lot of schools use February and April as well. Those tests are also incredibly useful for a lot of test takers who are looking to improve their position off the wait list or to improve their scholarship consideration discussions that they're having. So those can be game-changing LSATs if you're in one of those positions there. So we'll certainly do some crystal balls coming up for that April test, and maybe the June we'll throw in there as well. It kind of depends on what we see here in February.
Yeah.
And then we'll also be doing recaps of all those exams as well on the podcast here.
Yep. So a lot of value in those tests. They're late in the cycle, obviously. But again, they can really help to move the needle on a number of different things. But speaking of test dates, Dave, since the last time we recorded, we have been given by LSAC a lot of information about some future test dates. They have finally announced all of the test dates through, I believe, June 2024, June of next year.
The next cycle. And we knew it was coming right in January here. And they've used essentially the same template that they've had for this current cycle that we're in. So there's 4 tests in the fall in October, September, October, and November. And then there are 4 tests in the spring in the same pattern that we have January, February, not in March, and then April and June. Most of those are 2-day tests, John, but 2 of them are just 1 day only, which is a little bit odd to me.
Yeah, that was the first thing that caught my eye too. February and April of 2024, as of now, are set to run just on the Friday, February 9th and April 12th. I take some issue with this. So LSAC, if you're listening, and I hope you are, at least for this portion of it.
They are.
Yeah. Add an extra day. It's really unfair to run tests only on a weekday, a Friday at that. There are people out there with full-time jobs or people who can't find childcare or something during the week.
School, all sorts of things going on.
Classes, exams. Yeah. So the fact that they haven't included a weekend day yet bothers me quite a bit. And here's hoping they add weekends for both February and April.
Yes. And if you're preparing for any of these upcoming exams, one thing to always keep in mind is that we run a series of free seminars throughout the year. And we've got those free seminars coming up. There's another one here in January on the 24th. Covers common flaws in logical reasoning. There's 2 in February, one on the 8th about understanding templates in logic games, and one on the 22nd about parallel reasoning questions in logical reasoning. And then the next one after that is on March 8th. It's about reading comprehension and comparative reading. No cost for those. You can sign up at powerscore.com/free. Not forward flash, free seminars. And that is something you can sign up for all of them. You can sign up for one of them. We try to cover all the topics, and we'll add more after March 8th. But that's about the next 2 months, month and a half. That's heading out there.
Yeah, good
But it
variety
gives
there too. I mean, literally every section is covered and some pretty heavy hitters. That common flaw is the next one coming up on the 24th. I tend to look at that as like probably 2 free points. If you're familiar with the way the flaws in this test work, there's going to be a couple of questions that just test recognizable categorical errors. You and I did an entire series of podcasts, I think 3 episodes devoted just to those common flaws. Clearly important. And the fact that we're giving this out to people for free, make an effort to be there on the 24th if you can. It's a good one.
Yeah, and talking about that, I think people who listen to this podcast know that we have a real strong dedication to having either free or inexpensive LSAT prep options, whether it's the crystal balls, these podcasts, these free seminars, even trying to keep the Bible cost relatively within control. One of the things that we went to our marketing team with was we wanted to give podcast listeners a special deal, so to speak, in terms of getting a discount for something that is more expensive, which is our courses. And they came back to us since the last episode, and they've actually done that for us. So we now have a special code that if you're signing up for one of our classes anytime soon, whether it's the live online or the on demand, you can use the code PSPOD Jan23. So PS Pod January 23. All lowercase, and get a $200 discount off the live online or a $50 off the first month of the on demand. If you do that before February 20th, 23, when it expires, you'll get that. It doesn't combine with other discounts that might be out there, but it at least is something that Jon and I have been asking for a long time. We're glad to finally be able to convey that. So if you're listening, you didn't hear it at the very beginning, you won't hear it at the very end, but you'll hear it right here. You gives you a month to use that. Just a little extra special thing that we've thrown out there for listeners.
Yeah, this was a pretty nice thing. That I was pleased when they were able to come back and allow us to do this for everybody out there listening to the podcast, because I don't know, we tend to feel the love. The fact that we can now share it with a course discount is pretty great.
Absolutely. And that aside, let's talk about, really the content that is interesting to people who have now taken the LSAT, and that is the January 23 LSAT itself, which is the main administration is largely done now. We waited until these Wednesday test takers, these international paper pencil takers were done, and that's why this is coming out on a Thursday. But remember, the score release for this will be Wednesday, February 1st at 9 a.m. As Jon said earlier, retakers will get it at the same time. Even if you have yet to take the LSAT, you'll get it. So let's walk through a little bit of the details of this test, just from an overall standpoint. And Jon, I'll start off with the notes that we always take about the test size on each day, which I think is always just kind of interesting to see how small or how big the cohort is. This test started on Friday, and it was scheduled to be about 9,500 test takers on Friday, which is a sizable number overall. It probably ended up being about 8,600. Anybody who follows me on Twitter saw me kind of like posting progress reports. How many people had started the test, how many people had finished it throughout the day. On Saturday, it was scheduled to be even larger. It was 10,600 was the schedule. Ultimately, it was about 9,700 people who took it. So those were the two big hitting days. A lot of the content that we'll talk about, we saw throughout those 2 days. Then on Wednesday, there was the international LSAT as well as the paper and pencil LSAT. That was about 1,400 people total. And about 1,250 actually took that test overall. So this administration comes in at about 19,500, which is a substantially sized administration. Not the biggest, but definitely not anywhere close to the smallest.
Yeah, this is a big one, especially for a January this time of year. What's also interesting to me is the attrition here, how much this actually dropped off from where we saw it kind of peak several weeks back. I think this test was up in the 28,000 range for a bit.
It was.
Yeah. And we have slowly seen that kind of bleed off as people made other decisions or maybe got responses back from schools. I think we're going to see the same thing for the February test, especially as the scores drop on February 1st. A lot of people have that February test just sitting there as almost a placeholder, depending on how January ended up going. So whatever the February numbers are now, they're going to shrink pretty substantially too, I suspect.
Yeah, maybe I'll post this on Twitter later today or perhaps even later this week. But one of the things that I had talked to LSAC about was that bleed down, that melt, as we call it, from the high of which was over 28,000 registered to ultimately what the number is now, which is closer to 20,000. And they made the point that last year the melt was even greater.
Wow.
So this year there was a higher degree of retention as opposed to last year. So maybe I'll post that kind of comparison. Maybe I'll also post kind of like the way the numbers jumped around in case anybody's interested, because it is kind of cool to see the way it rises up super fast right to the registration deadline, and then it comes down constantly throughout the following month there. But speaking of this test,
Yeah.
out of all those 20,000 people that have taken it roughly so far, how was the setup in terms of ProctorU and, test issues based upon kind of some of the, ways we've looked at this in the past? Were there any systemic issues?
Another piece of the puzzle we always try to track pretty closely is, how the experience has actually gone for people, how smoothly or rockily have things actually unfolded as the administration played out. And I'm happy to report here, at least from everything that I could see, that this seemed to be one of the smoothest ones we've had in quite a while. I didn't see any widespread issues. I didn't see anything like systemically problematic where people in a certain location at a certain time were just sort of globally unable to complete the test or running into problems. Were there individual issues? Of course, there always are. But even those seem pretty few and far between. The major thing, though, is that we didn't see anything either day of the main testing where it seemed as though something crippled the whole system. So that is great news.
And I think when you say it was smooth or ran smoothly, that's what we're referring to.
Right.
Was there a major outage that affected dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of people? No, we didn't see that. So that's good news. But there were clearly a number of individual issues. This is something that I've said in the past is unavoidable. It is built into the system. They expect it to happen. It's why we have this retake set up, a good week and a half or so after the original administration. There's a proctor who screws things up. Somebody can't get the test started for technical issues. Your Wi-Fi goes out. There's all sorts of things that can and will happen every single time. For those individuals, we know that it's catastrophic because you're all fired up to do it, and then all of a sudden, it's like the rug got pulled out from underneath you. So we're not saying that, oh, hey, it was smooth for everybody. We're just saying that there was no systemic problem. Individual problems, though, there always are. Some of those.
On the whole, pretty good. And look, here's hoping this sets something of a tone for the rest of the year. If January is some foreshadowing, then I expect the next 7 tests or whatever we've got to look forward to run equally smoothly, as they should, frankly. They've been doing this LSAC and ProctorU long enough that they ought to have a pretty well-oiled machine by now. This test seemed to reflect that.
Yeah, people may be surprised to hear that my view of this is that I think on LSAC's side, they do understand how this runs. I think they do have the system down pretty well. It's ProctorU that actually worries me the most.
Me too.
They're just a vendor for LSAC. They've got tons of clients. This is just another test to them. And I think that is where the biggest problem comes in, is proctors telling people wrong information. You can't use Control F. Yes, you can. Don't even ask about it.
Don't ask.
To interrupting and taking control of the mouse or typing things into, bars and stuff. And it's like, it's always a proctor issue, that I fear the most when dealing with this test. Those aren't going away either.
Yeah, I don't really see a way around that, unfortunately. But like I said, I do think on the whole, this is a pretty good one. If the rest of the year ran similarly, I would have few complaints.
On the whole, yes.
On the whole, yeah, of course.
All right.
I mean, I'd find something to complain about. It just wouldn't be that thing.
That is, yes, correct.
All right, we're getting close.
Yes, we are. But as usual, there's a list of disclaimers that we like to talk about. And if you haven't heard these before, please listen to them, because they explain some of the things that we do and how we do it. They also explain why we say some of the things that we say and what we, prefer this information, be what's done with it. So there's a list, but I'm going to go through it. If you haven't heard it before, I'll try to make it spicier and more interesting. But the very first recommendation and disclaimer is the same as the last one, and it's the one I always make, which is we ask so nicely, but also strenuously, that you not summarize this online. Summaries so often miss the nuance of what we were talking about, and since this is free and easily accessible, and people have the ability to just listen to it, we ask that they come and listen to it from us as opposed to having a summary posted online. It bums me out every single time I see someone summarize it, because I have yet to see one that is actually wholly accurate or doesn't somehow mischaracterize something that was said. So, simple request. I hope everybody listens to it. I love it when I see people say, hey, they asked us not to do that. I'm like, that's right. You're cool. Secondly, how the information works is to some extent public knowledge. We're using partial public knowledge, but a lot of what we do is not public. We have a huge database of information. We receive reports from students, from instructors. We're able to tie all these things together. We do a lot of work offline to figure out exactly what it is that we're looking at and to make predictions about difficulty. I get asked every single time, explain your process.
Yeah.
And my answer has slowly devolved to no. We won't do it. Partially because I've done it before, but we use information about what we know are public tests. So a question, a logic game topic or a reading comp topic or a logical reasoning, to tie it back to information in this huge database that we have on all these exams and all the experimental uses, and to figure out what we know about it. And in some cases, we have an incredible amount about these tests. The exams that were administered this past weekend, we know a huge amount about. We're very comfortable with the analysis that we were making on all of this. But to try to explain it is, part magic, part statistics, part nuance, and, plain old discussion. We don't always, agree as we're going through it, but we generally know that the information that we're presenting is accurate. We have not been wrong about identifying the experimental section. When scoring scales come out, we compare it to what we said. The last one that came out, we were right about. So we're able to kind of go through this over time and reconfirm for ourselves that we're doing it the right way and that the information that we have is fully accurate. And that's part of the process. If we were to make a mistake, we would come out and tell people. This is about trying to help. Keeping people in the dark doesn't help. And I think our reputation at this point is established that we know what we're talking about, where I wouldn't feel bad if we made a mistake, but I don't want to. And I don't think we've made any mistakes today, John, so I feel good about it.
Yeah, I feel really good about this one.
Yeah, we're both very confident. So the next kind of disclaimer is that when you're talking about this test online, keep this in mind. Your section order is irrelevant. When people say, hey, I'm going to tell you about the test or I want to give you some information, the questions that I ask them is never about section order. I'm more interested in, topics or difficulty perceptions and things like that, just to make sure it aligns with what we already have. So when somebody says I had LR, RC, LG, LR, and someone else says I had that same order, it doesn't mean you had the same test. You might have had the LRs in different orders. You might have had completely different LGs or RCs, or all of it might be different. Sections and orders change all day long. And at least as far as disclosing information, keep in mind that LSAC doesn't want people to identify the experimental section early on. That's why we don't talk about this test on Friday or Saturday. We wait until Wednesday when the test has been fully administered and all that section content goes out of use. So at that point, they allow you to talk about the generalities, what you saw in RC or LG, the topics. They just don't want you to talk about what the answer to number 7 was or what the rules said in individual logic games, because that could be prejudicial for future test takers. And that's why we won't disclose that. Even if we have that information, we don't disclose it on any of these podcasts. And I can tell you that we have a lot of that information. Another thing I'll remind people is that when you take the actual LSAT, it feels so much worse than taking a practice test. And this colors your perception as you look at the exam. A lot of times people walk out of the LSAT and say, that was the worst thing I ever took. That's the hardest LG, or that's the hardest RC. I understand that feeling, and we're not downplaying it. We just know from historically doing this that there's a negativity bias that creeps into your recollection. So later on, when we're talking about difficulty, if what we say doesn't match what you recall or what you felt, there's quite probably a good reason for that. And that is that you were under huge amounts of pressure and dealing with all of that. And that changes the way you think about the test. And so in that same vein, when we say something is easy or difficult, I will remind everybody, we're not saying it's easy. We think every LSAT section and every LSAT is a tough experience, and they are all difficult. We're talking about ranges within a high level of difficulty. So if we said a logic game section is easier, we still mean it's hard. It's just on the easy side of very hard as opposed to the middle or high side of hard. So just remember that, because I think sometimes it gets out there that people are like, they said it was an easy section. I'm like, I didn't say that. I said it was easier than the other section, but I never said it was easy. Nothing on this test is easy, and everybody who takes these exams already knows that. Keep in mind as well that it can be really tough in your recollection to know for sure when you're talking to other people if you are talking about the same things. The test makers actively attempt to confuse you by placing the same topics in multiple sections. There's a great example from a few tests ago where they used Nigeria in 2 separate reading comp passages. And I could see people online talking about, oh, I had that Nigerian passage as well, knowing based on other things they'd said that they actually had different sections, but they didn't realize it. Doesn't really affect your test taking experience, but it can be confusing for people after the test. So just be careful and make sure that what it is that you're talking about with other people is in fact what you think that it is. It's been happening for a while and it's a known tactic that they use. Also, when we talk about what is real and experimental, it's based on certain assumptions about reusage. And one of the big ones is this: if they used a section previously and we were able to confirm without a doubt that it was real, when it reappears and is reused on this test, our expectation is that that section will be scored and will be real. It would make no sense for them to have a real section and then come back and give us an experimental. Finally, or almost finally, you might not hear us talk about your section below. Sometimes that happens because people forget about the topics. They just don't remember very clearly. Sometimes people are in a very small cohorts where not many people took the same test as they did. That's especially the case if someone's taken the LSAT multiple times. You might have seen this content already. They'll give you new content if that is in fact the case. And we know that there are some exceptions. Sometimes they just do this. So if that's the case, if we didn't hear from you, we have no way to actually discuss that information or identify it as for sure being in use. So you won't hear us talk about it. But I can guarantee that the sections that we're going to talk about as real today were used for the vast majority of students, if not all of them. And then the last one, once again, please don't summarize this online. The first is the same as the last. We would really just prefer that people hear it directly from us. They can drop that timestamp right in here and be like, yeah, just go to minute, whatever it is right now, 30 or something like that, and go listen to it directly. I know it's not minute 30, but you know what I mean.
There you go. It's like the first 2 rules of Fight Club. Do not talk about this online. All right.
Don't punch yourself in the face is rule number 2.
There you go. Well, Dave, that was some heavy lifting. Thank you for doing it. I fought the urge to finish this beer and lost.
It's okay.
Thank you. Let's do this. Before we get into what would really be like the main administration, so the domestic tests and what turned out to be the paper and pencil test today as well, let's take a look at the international exams that we saw really last night and kind of through this morning due to time zone differences. And let's start there because the international people, at least from what I could tell, got a different test than the domestic people. So there's really a couple of different versions of this floating around. Let's take care of our friends overseas to kick things off here. Fair?
Totally fair.
Awesome. All right. And I'll do the bulk of this since I think you've paid your penance just now.
Yeah.
What we've seen from international people, and I think this applies to people literally globally. I talked to people from Korea. I talked to people in Finland, France. They all had the same test from what I could tell. And what it turned out to be was a reuse of test content sections from most recently the October 2021 LSAT. This is a test they have pulled from before a couple of times. We talked about this in the crystal ball, that's one of those like partially reused tests that they keep dipping into. We saw it again here overseas. Originally, interestingly enough, people are really tracing the continued administrations of this. I think the first place that this test content appeared was back in March of 2019. That's when we first saw this as scored sections. Experimentally, I think it goes all the way back to June 2017 for anyone really keeping score. So we have seen this content before. I recognized it pretty much immediately as I started to hear about it. Let me lay it out for people, and hopefully if you're overseas, this rings some bells. I'll start with games. 23 questions, again, from the October 21 LSAT. The first game, I believe, was about restaurant specials, special menu items being offered over the course of a week. The second game was about a debate between 2 debate teams. There was a game in third, I believe, about 3 different criminals visiting different towns on 5-day trips. And then finally, it wrapped up with a game about 2 different authors publishing a book on planting crops. And the authors had different chapter assignments, basically, on the crop types. I think it was grain and stuff. But those were the 4 scored games, not only from October 21, but that we saw here in January 23. internationally. Hopefully those ring a bell. If you took the international test and had a different set of games, I regret not hearing from you because it's been pretty universal up to this point.
Excellent.
So far, so good. Let's jump to reading comp. 27 questions. Again, the source is the same. October 2021, used everywhere from what I could tell internationally. Here were the 4 passages. It started with a passage about tipping servers. There was then a tricky passage on hominids developing or evolving an upright posture in the savanna or grasslands, these kind of out of Africa theories. There was a third passage about Argentinian fiction, this novel by Roberto Arlt, and the irony with challenging social norms or societal norms in literature. And then the comparative passage to end things was on a bill restricting women and children's work hours in early 20th century Britain. Again, I think kind of a challenging comparative passage to end there, and that was a tough section. But again, the single reading comp that I saw used for everyone overseas last night and today as we record this. What that leaves then is logical reasoning. Everyone I saw internationally that had an experimental section, so didn't have an accommodation to drop it, had the same experimental type, which was logical reasoning. So everyone I saw had a single games that I just talked about, single reading comp I just talked about, 2 sets of logical reasoning. So here is the mystery, basically. I'm only going to cover the real logical reasoning, and it was this. Also from October 2021, 25 questions. Here are a few of them. If even one of these matches what you saw, this was your scored section. There was a question about eating meat versus vegetarians and this chemical, TMAO, and various supplements that people take. Question about rainfall and temperature levels changing over recent decades and how that was related to humidity and weather predictions. There was a question about disease incidence in mountain and lowland possums. Kind of interesting. A chemical plant was being built by a lake and polluting the water. There was a question about beans in the Middle Ages and amino acids. And then a question about War of the Worlds and this radio, kind of famous radio broadcast. Any of those ring a bell for you, that was your scored section of logical reasoning. Your other section, which I'm not going to get into, was experimental. It didn't count. You can ignore it.
Yeah, and one of the things that we have kind of tended to do recently is to not talk about logical reasoning experimental because it causes more confusion. It's hard to remember when there's 25, 26 questions in each one of these sections. It's really hard to remember whether that was section 1 or section 3. So by focusing on the real content, we found that it's easier for someone to be like, wait, that was my first section, and to remember it more clearly. Now, John, with that content there, let me cover the matrix on the scaling here and kind of like add that component in so that the international test takers can get a sense of how their test was shaping up.
By all means, go for it.
Yeah, and if you haven't heard us have this discussion before, from a matrix standpoint, we focus on the high-level difficulty. That's the easiest thing for us to see and to understand the effect of. As you go down the scale, it's harder for us to see the nuance because we can't see the actual questions, and that's where a lot of those nuanced difficulty moves will actually happen. So when we look at this, we start at a standard baseline of that you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. So when people say, what was the scale? Was it -7 or -8? That is what they're referring to, the number of questions missed to get a 170. So we start at 7, and then we go through each section, assess the difficulty, and see whether or not that moves the scale in any appreciable way. So starting at -7 for a 170, let's look at that logic game section. That's the one about the menu items, the debate, the criminal town visits, and the author chapters. This is not a section that is going to move the scale. It's in the medium range of difficulty, so it neither loosens it nor tightens it. It leaves your scale at -7. Then let's add in reading comprehension. That's tipping servers, hominids, the Robert Arlt Argentinian novel, and the work hours. That is a tough section, as John said. That will loosen your scale, move it from 7 to 8. And then finally, you get down to your LR, and we'll add that in. That's like the TMAO, the rainfall, the opossums, the lake pollution, and the question I never want to do about beans. That is a middle-of-the-road LR section. And when I say middle of the road, that doesn't mean it's easy. There are still hard questions in there, but there's always hard questions in LR. That does not change the scaling. And that means all international test takers with these 3 sections, we're looking at a -8 to get a 170 scale.
Yeah.
John, is there any chance this goes to -9 in your opinion?
I really don't see how it could for this. I didn't hear anything about those games or about that LR that made me think like it was even borderline. 0.5, as we sometimes talk about, and may talk about again tonight. To me, this is a pretty steady -8 for everybody. And that stays, I'm happy to say, consistent with the prior times we've seen this content come up. And we talked about this after October 2021. We talked about it after March 2019, one of the first earliest podcast episodes we ever did, I think. We've been right here at this exact same kind of outcome. We're willing to change. I'll put this out there. We're willing to make adjustments to this if we learn something new, if the feedback changes or we get some sort of like insight that we hadn't had previously. I'm more than willing to change what these scalings are. So this wasn't by just default going to be a -8. If this was the first I'd ever heard of it, it would have been a -8. I'm happy that it stayed consistent.
Yeah, that's, I think, a good point, is that every time they do these reuses, we reassess whether or not what we previously said about the test was accurate. And in this case, and also with the rest of the night, we're very comfortable that what we said previously is on the money here. So we previously would have said that this was a -8. It stays at -8. We're constantly evaluating whether or not what we're doing is accurate. That is the most important part of our process, is to make sure that we feel like what we've said previously is accurate and that what we're making claims about with new content is accurate. So we did look at it. No changes there, though, and that's your international test.
Yeah. Past accuracy and current/future accuracy, though, we always prioritize current and future. I'm happy to say I think we got this wrong back in October 2021 because we've learned this thing that changes it. In this case, we don't need to do that. And I'm happy about that, too.
Yeah, if we needed to correct something, we would. We don't need to.
Well, so we're happy there. Speaking of things I'm happy about, are we ready?
Yeah.
Let's get into this domestic January LSAT. And this will apply not only to the digital people, but also the paper and pencil people. From what I saw, they all essentially experienced the same content. So through the weekend and into today.
That is exactly right. And interestingly enough, when we went through the crystal ball, we made a couple predictions, John. One of them was that the most likely test to be used was April 21, which then informed our selection of various problem sets. So the big question is, was April 2021 used? How'd we do?
How did we do? I think a good case could be made here that this might have been the best one we've ever done. And we've got quite a few highlights under our belt. The main test that they used, in fact, the only test that they reused was, in fact, April 2021, the exact test that we suspected and told people that they were going to use. And you don't have to take our word for it. That crystal ball is still available. It's still public and free. You can go listen to us tell you this. The test we thought they would use is exactly the test that they did reuse. It's not the only content that people saw over the weekend. They never do just reuse a single test exclusively as it, but it is the only reuse that we saw, April 2021. They coupled that, as we'll discuss, with some new content, not a reuse, but things that we're seeing for the first time. No way to predict that, obviously. But
although a little bit.
Well, yeah, even then, I think we really excelled. But
yeah, so
the test reuse that we expected is exactly the test that we got.
Yeah, and that makes our life a lot easier. And it also helps students because when we made those predicted problem sets in the crystal ball, we used some of the information from our expectation of April 21 being reused to kind of inform the choices. And I got a couple messages from students saying exactly what I expected was on this test. And that is the best feeling in the world because that is what our job is. And we'll get a little bit more into that when we run through some of this stuff because we put topics on the screen that we said we thought had a pretty high likelihood of showing up. They did. We highlighted certain games that we thought had a pretty high likelihood of showing up. They did as well. I feel like this one was there was a high degree of clairvoyance, and we got a lot of messages to that effect saying, I'm so glad I sat and watched that. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. Maybe open a bottle of champagne at that point, too.
Yeah, it just occurred to me, too, that I think we're drinking the wrong drink. What am I doing with this Hawaiian beer? We should really have bubbles.
Why don't we get into the logic game sections? And I'll let you cover those, and then I'll cover reading comp after that.
Fair enough. That seems like a fair trade. So yeah, you and I both woke up Friday morning, hopped on the phone or the computer or whatever, trying to start to see what people we're experiencing, and we're almost instantly grinning because the first thing that we saw with Logic Games Friday morning was content from the April 2021 test. Let me tell you what those 4 games were. They were real, and again, immediately right out of the gate, these were being used. So one section of scored Logic Games, April 21, 23 questions. These were the 4 games. The first was about, I believe, a politician's speech. Some confusion over the topic. 6 topics being ordered. The second game was about clients being trained by 2 personal trainers. Game 3 had 4 different teams with industrial and mechanical engineers. Time-consuming game. And game 4, clearly the hardest of the set, was about district grants for different districts for roads, parks, stations, them trying to do some sort of like municipal stuff. Those 4 games counted, and again, we have the source. We know where they're from.
Yeah, and not an easy section, certainly, especially that last game. Taking some work to get through. But we'll talk about the scaling a little bit later. How about the other real section that we saw for everybody?
Yeah, and as the way Dave phrased it kind of alludes to, there were only 2 scored sections of games in use the entire time, at least that we've seen. One is the 4 that I just mentioned. The other 4, which are new games, are these 23 questions. The first game was about chess matches. Second game was about 5 bands performing concerts in 3 different parks. The third game was about 4 professors teaching geology course sections, trying to assign them to which course they taught or section they taught. And then, a real doozy, game 4 was about tracing a leaked government secret back to its source through a series of continued leaks and discussions. Easily the hardest and certainly the weirdest game, I might argue, of the entire 8 that were scored, certainly of the 4 in that section.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on that. However, there was a way to have been prepared for that particular game, because if you go back to September 2016 and you look at game 4 on that LSAT, you have the infamous virus game.
Computer virus.
Computer virus.
Yeah.
And one of the things in the crystal ball that I talked about was we know there are games floating around that have similar modeling characteristics to this virus game. Go do the virus game. Do it repeatedly. Make sure that you know it backwards and forwards. And thankfully, some of our students, some of the people who were in that crystal ball did that. And we started getting messages after that section showed up in use where people were like, thank God I did that, because I got to that and I just felt, like I was the king of the world because I was able to know where to start to do it. One person wrote me and said, I laughed out loud because I couldn't believe that I was actually seeing this. And you guys had said it would be on the test and there was a high probability. That's game changing, quite honestly. And that's
quite literally.
Obviously doing LSAT prep is about changing futures. But if somebody who is going to miss 2 or 3 questions all of a sudden doesn't at a really high level, that raises scores in a way that can have a really meaningful impact, both in schools that you get into as well as in the scholarship money that you get. So that was a tough game. There's no doubt about it. And even worse if you hadn't really prepared with that virus game. But hopefully you listened to what we had to say about it and you were able to do that.
Yeah, I got an absolute flood of messages really through the weekend and even today a bit. I continue to get them basically about this game. And you could see immediately that the messages split people into 2 very distinct groups. There was one group that were like, what in the world is this game? I've never seen anything like this. This is crazy. This has to be experimental, right? No. There was the other group that said, oh my God, thank you so much to you and Dave for telling us essentially the twin game of this to do. And Dave, I remember distinctly during the crystal ball when you had that recommended problems or games up on the screen, you put a big highlight on the computer virus game. You said you must do this before your test. Those who did found this game to be immediately familiar. I won't say easy, but recognizable, substantive, because they had done something so analogous previously. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, PT79, Game 4. If you had that government document game on your real LSAT, go do PT79, Game 4. Go do the virus and compare the 2. Go to our forum and look at the virus explanation for that game and watch how much of a difference it would have made if you'd had that exposure versus not.
Yeah, I think one of your students had said, you guys should be charging $1,000 for a crystal ball. That's not what our plan is. We like the idea of equity and access to this kind of information. That's why we have it for free. when we do it. But this is also what good LSAT prep is. In the LSAT, the past is prologue. They reuse ideas constantly. So it may be a piece of information that only we had about the fact that there were games that were very similar to the computer virus game floating around. But this is what LSAT prep is supposed to do, is to prepare you for what you see on your test. We just had a little bit more specific recommendation here than anybody else out there. So if you are looking at the logic games that you had, though, pretty much everybody that we talked to had one of these two sections as real. We didn't hear any counter reports. That doesn't mean that those were the only logic game sections. One of the things I said in the crystal ball was that there were likely to be fewer logic games experimentals. And that was, in fact, the case. There was only a single experimental that was used in logic games. And I think, John, you noted to me that after about midday on Friday, they stopped using another experimental logic game. So we know that logic games as the experimental section of this test were used less frequently than the other two, which is what we expected.
Yeah, that's what we said. After about early afternoon on Friday, I did not see another usage of experimental games for the entire time. None on Saturday, none Friday evening, which again aligns with exactly what we said in that crystal ball. It's not that they're not going to use experimental games. It's that they're going to use LR and RC more often. There was a thread on Reddit that slightly mischaracterized that. So I'm happy we get a chance here to correct it. And as you said before, that $1,000, that actually wasn't a student of mine. That was just a Reddit stranger with an interesting insight. But did message me and was like, you guys are wizards. How do you do this? How do you make it free? Why do you make it free? You're fools. That's basically the take.
Why don't you run through what we have in terms of the experimental?
Happy to do it. Yeah, so if any of these games, if you had two games and you can match any of these, this is a section that does not count. Also 23 questions. Here were the 4 games. The first, I believe, was about painting rooms, different rooms in a house. Game 2 was arranging 7 people into 2 categories, possibly neighborhoods, a little vague on that. Game 3 was about embezzlement. And then the hardest game here, 4th game as well, was about films being released over 3 days, either on digital streaming services or in theaters. Those games did not count.
All right. So we know that's the case. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about the scaling of those 2 logic game sections and how it fits into the overall picture in a minute. But let's move on to reading comprehension and talk about what was real and what was experimental there. And it was very similar to logic games. We saw 2 separate sections of reading comprehension used that were real. We saw 1 section used that was experimental. And so we've got a pretty good handle on all of this. Let's start with the one that was used from the April 2021 LSAT. Not an easy section at all. The passages, the first one was about economic irrationality and legal decision-making. Really, a lot of people called this omission bias overall. The second passage was about Mexican murals and frescoes, which was interesting, and I'm sure John will comment on that in a minute or two, featuring Diego Rivera and Juan Orozco. The third passage was about water shortages and subsidies, especially in developing countries. And then the last passage was about blue jays or scrub jays and their behavior around hiding food when observed versus alone. And the third passage there about water shortage was the comparative one. Now, when we take a look at something like that, that was a real section, and we know for a fact that that was scored if you had it. And John, this was another good example where I thought the crystal ball made a really big difference, because I know that when you were talking about reading comprehension, you were telling people these are the kinds of topics you want to be prepared for. Did it include any of the content on this test?
Yeah, one of the things I've tried to do in the reading comp portion of the last 2 crystal balls actually was to put a slide up that talks about common themes, common talking points and topics, essentially giving people the opportunity to familiarize themselves with some of the things that they're likely to encounter. Dark matter and dark energy, Lawrence Krauss, certain authors and things. On that screen for the January, February crystal ball, not only did I have Mexican murals on there, I also had blue jay behavior. Literally 2 of the 4 passages that we saw here. So it's hard for us to feel like we could have given any more to people to kind of preview or preface this. It was all there.
And I've said this before, and I'll say it again just because this is the right moment. We're able to do this right now. We shouldn't be able to. It's because they don't have as many tests to reuse as they need. And so they're in a little bit of a tight bind. Eventually, they will build enough tests where they can get themselves out of this jam. But for now, it allows us with a fairly high degree of accuracy to predict what is coming up on these LSATs. I've been doing this a long time. I've never seen anything like it. It should not happen, but it is. And that's why we do what we do. The day the crystal ball is a situation where we're like, we don't know what they're going to do is the day we won't have crystal balls. So as long as you see them on the roster, if you're taking an upcoming LSAT, it is definitely worth your while because we are able to make changes and choices and shape this according to what is most likely to happen. It doesn't mean that every single thing is going to be perfect, but this is a huge advantage to know, hey, I should really do that virus game a bunch, or it might be useful if I, had some familiarity with Mexican murals. What an advantage to somebody who might not have otherwise had knowledge of those things.
Yeah.
So that first section there was real. It was scored. Let's take a look at the other real section that was floating around out there. This started off with a passage about architecture, especially in practice versus how it is taught in universities. Then a passage about population growth fears in France, references to Thomas Malthus and Arthur Young. Another passage that was comparative about brand value, especially intangible assets, and how that value is not captured by current accounting standards. And then a passage about space motion sickness in astronauts, specifically the study by Dr. Patricia Cowings, as well as autogenic training. So probably not as hard as that first passage, but that was real or that first passage set,
Right.
the first section. But this was also a scored section as well. Both of those had 27 questions, as did the experimental section.
Yep.
So a lot of 27 questions floating around here, more work to do in RC. The experimental section that we saw used very widely had these 4 passage topics. The first one was jellyfish population blooms. Sounds pretty interesting to me. That was the comparative passage. Then a passage about Argentina and Uruguay and political economic development, kind of like how they developed in a different way, despite having some similarities. Then one about attorney-client privilege with Elle Woods, amazingly enough, a Legally Blonde reference, an example being used. And then finally, the role of the narrator in poems and the approach to love and females, and a little bit of a Chaucerian reference as well. So, John, you made a really interesting observation, I thought, about this Elle Woods passage and kind of the fact that it was experimental.
Yeah, it's interesting. We started to see, and it's happened enough times now that I don't think that this is just some kind of happy accident. I think that there's some legitimacy to this, that it seems to be in a lot of the experimental sections of late, in the past year or two, that there's some almost like pop culture topicality that's driving the content creation here. In this case, they referenced Elle Woods and Legally Blonde, and I realize that's not a recent movie, but it's certainly in the kind of pop culture, the zeitgeist really that's out there, that it's a strange thing to appear. Back in August of 2022, they had a passage that talked about like vampire fiction, but it specifically referenced the Twilight novels or movies and Edward Cullen. Dave, if you'll recall, also very recently, there was an experimental passage about the Golden Girls, the TV show. And my hero, Betty White. So, yeah. So you're starting to see this almost thematic. It's always been experimental so far, but this almost like thematic sense of them trying to look in touch or sort of culturally aware. I wouldn't use this as a sole gauge or litmus test if you were to see some passage, say in February, that dealt with something topical or recent. I wouldn't immediately chalk that section up as experimental solely on that. But there is a theme here. There is some kind of trend that and I know you too, Dave, have noticed, and that frankly I appreciate, because what this means is soon enough these are going to start being real sections, and I think that's going to be a fun day for reading comprehension when you don't have to read about work hours for children in early Britain, in 19th century Britain, but instead you can read about Twilight movies.
Yeah, you're getting more cultural currency. And so far, it's been experimental. And so that's been kind of an interesting thing to see that. But it will be real sooner or later. So you can't just say, oh, this is about something relatively recent or, more movie book oriented from this century. But You don't get that kind of rule of saying, that's it, that's experimental, because eventually it will be real. But it is interesting right now to see them do it that way.
Yeah. Golden Girls, by the way, was from October 2022. So August 22 had Twilight and Edward Cullen. October 22, Golden Girls. January 23, Elle Woods.
Yeah, interesting lineup there of topics. So I'll just leave that for what it is. And we're not going to talk any further about Edward Cullen.
Yeah, I think that's enough.
Yeah. So in any event, that section about jellyfish and Argentina and Uruguay and attorney clients and Elle Woods, that's experimental. So if you had that section, you know where it was. That did not count. Let's move on to logical reasoning. And John, this is interesting because there were more than just, 3 sections that were in use here. There were 2 real sections, and then there were several experimental sections as well.
Yeah, I counted at least 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 experimental sections. A lot of experimental LR out there.
And we've gotten really good information on all those experimentals, so we feel pretty comfortable about it. But at the same time, we know that if we start talking about all those topics, it just gets so confusing. Anybody who had 2 LRs had 50 or 51 questions, and that's just, it muddies the water so much. So what we're going to do is we are going to focus on questions that we know were in the 2 real sections that they used. And we'll walk our way through those topics. John, I'll leave that to you.
Oh, all right. Lucky me. Especially lucky me because the first one here we already had a lot of information on. This is the 3rd and final set that they pulled from that predicted April 2021 test. 25 questions. This content is real. I'll read 7 or 8 of these. If you can match even a single one of these, though, to one of your sections of LR, that is your scored section. There's a question that got a lot of attention about Mars and a watermelon-sized nickel meteorite that somehow had penetrated Mars's atmosphere. There was a question in there about philosophers and physicists, a question about frowning, the muscles in your face for frowning, and emotional literacy. I think this kind of alluded to Botox and injections. There was one about college courses using translated books. What sounded like an interesting but difficult question about cackling geese and building their nests on Canadian tundra, non-overlapping territories and things. Question about medical journals having more corrections or needing more corrections now than ever because of pressure on researchers to publish more. A question on classical music composers getting negative reviews. And then I'll end with this. A question about why sunscreen hasn't reduced the incidence of skin cancer.
Yeah, I like that. I bet I know the answer to that, but we're not going to talk about it.
There you go. Yeah, a lot of interesting topics through there. But like I said, all of those are real. So if even one, and this is all it takes, it just takes one. If even one of those matches what you had, that entire section is scored. And again, 25 questions, all of that from April 21, all of that in accordance with the predictions and recommended sets that we put for LR in the crystal ball as well. Which I heard feedback from a lot of people that I'm really glad I did section X. So there you go.
Excellent. So let's now look at the other real LR, which was also 25 questions.
Also 25. Yes. So from what we can tell here, everyone who took the domestic test had 75 scored questions. No matter what combination of these, 23 for games, 27 RC, 25 for logical reasoning. Here's the other section of real LR, and these are new, so this was not something we could have predicted. I'll give you some topics. I believe it began with a question on scraping tools and whether that indicated that prehistoric people made their own clothes. Faulty airbags in sport and economy cars coming off the same assembly line. The health benefits of standing desks versus regular desks. Regulation of drones under current aerial vehicle laws. Question that a lot of people talked about, that it's a bad idea to rewash produce that's already been triple washed. Question I'd love to read about guitars being hung up as artwork or displayed as artwork and people feeling melancholy. One on cougars preying on bighorn sheep in a park. Common question on maple leaf on the Canadian flag. A lot of people talked about that. Pollinating low bush blackberries and that being affected by black flies. And then finally, another question that got a lot of attention about a gene for the lack of pigmentation in hair and that it was paternally inherited, passed on by people's fathers.
Nice. And I know that guitars as artwork is a big theme in your life since you got a bunch of them hanging in your house. So
I think there's 11 guitars in the room I'm actually recording this in right now. So yeah, I'm tripping over guitars in this place.
I'd say that qualifies. Yeah, the question that stands out to me there is one that I don't want to do, which is about health benefits of standing desks versus regular desks, because I'm strongly anti-standing desks.
Yeah, you take a real firm stance. No pun intended.
Pun intended. Uh, Now, if you did have a section out there that was 26 questions, that was your experimental section then. So that might be another way for you to figure it out, because those are the two real sections that we've identified. We have the full list of questions in both of those. We feel very comfortable with them. The remainder of the sections were experimental. And as we said before, we're not going to cover that because it just muddies the water and makes it harder for people to recall what the topics were. That brings us to the final approach on the difficulty discussion and the scaling discussion. So once again, I'll just remind everybody, the scoring matrix that we look at here is based upon the number of questions you can miss to get a 170. And we start off with the baseline default of you can miss 7 questions. And then we adjust it according to the difficulty of each section that you might have had. One of the things I'll remind people is that we tend to be on the conservative side. And that is because we want the outcome that somebody has to either be as good or better than they expected, not to somehow be worse. And if we were really more liberal on the scaling, it might lead people into thinking they were going to get a better score than they were actually going to get. And we'd rather have the reverse be the case.
Yeah, I'll make the comment to that this is clearly not a popularity play. It would be, it'd be very easy for us to make people happy by just saying, like, I think this is probably a minus 11. But we're more concerned with not just being accurate, but if we're going to missing on the side of conservatism. So that's the way that we tend to approach this. If that means sometimes that we get a little bit of harsh feedback or disappointment, that is our burden to bear.
I'd rather speak the truth now than to say something that is false but makes people happy. So let's just all be aware of that. But what will happen here is as we go through each section, what we'll do is we'll cover the topic and then we'll talk about how that would adjust it. So as you listen here, what you want to do is start off with that -7 figure in your mind and then see what we say about adjusting it, whether it stays the same, whether it loosens it, whatever the case may be. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch it up a little bit. Usually we do logic games first. I'm going to do reading comp and logical reasoning first, and then we're going to end with logic games, because I think there's more of a discussion there. So everybody starts off with -7. Let's go with reading comprehension first. If you had the rational economic choices, Mexican murals, water subsidies, Blue Jays passage, that's a tough passage set. That is going to loosen your scale from 7 to 8. So then you could miss 8 questions to get a 170. Let's look at the other scored reading comprehension. That's the architecture, population growth, brand value in the space, motion sickness. This passage set is not going to move the scale. We feel like it's in the medium range. So if you had that, you would stay at -7 to miss or to get a 170 there. So right away, we've bifurcated the entire group into one of two directions. Everybody's either -7 or -8 at this point. Some people are probably happier and other people less happy. Let's add LR to this. Both of these sections are not going to have an effect on the scale, so everybody's going to stay where they are. So if you had the Mars meteorite and the frowning and the cackling geese, that does not move your scale. And if you had the prehistoric scraping tools and clothes, the stupid standing desk question, the rewashing produce, that also stays 0. So everybody is -7 or -8 after reading comprehension and logical reasoning. That takes us to logic games.
Yep. And I am 100% with you so far on this. No spoilers, but there's clearly a reason we did RC and LR first. You and I are in lockstep with how we see those sections. I think we're going to be really close on games too, but it's certainly the trickiest of the three.
I think this it makes it harder because this one's more in the middle line. But let's start off with the first of the 2 logic game section. This is the one we've talked about previously. This is April 2021's reuse. This is the politician's speech, the clients and personal trainers, the engineering teams, and then grants awarded to districts. This is not an easy section, John. And we've talked about it in the past. What we've done is we've said that it is a hard section overall, but it is not so hard that 170 level scores shouldn't do well. But it does change the scaling down scale. So as you get into 165, 160, it's moving the scale for you. I think this is the harder of the two sections, which we'll address in further detail when we talk about the second one. And I think there's a real debate as to whether it's 0.5 or whether it would move the scale. What are your thoughts?
I'm more inclined, perhaps, than you, not to put words in your mouth, to think that this probably would, that this would probably loosen it by 1. But we're into that murky fractional type of assignment. So is it a full 1? Is it a clear 0? It's neither of those, obviously, to me. It's probably like a 0.8 or something. And I don't want us to ever go down that road where we start assigning decimals. My instinct is to think that Grants game was probably difficult enough, given the 3 ahead of it, that this would probably move the scale. So I could see this taking people to -8 or -9 if they had it.
Yeah,
what are your thoughts, Dave?
I understand that, and I'm not that far away from you. My feeling on this is like, also don't want to get into decimalizing this. That is just an impossibility. I feel like this is one of those ones where the test makers look at it and say, look, it's hard to get a 170. You have to be a really good test taker. It's not supposed to be easy. You should walk away thinking it was hard. I feel like it probably moves the scale shortly after 170. So we start to see that movement effect at like 168 or 167. But I'm really on the line with this. We call it a 0.5 because there's arguments to be made in both directions. We know for sure that it'll affect the scale at like the 160 or the 155 type of level.
Yeah.
So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that it's not entirely clear on the way that comes out. I've looked at the section. I've looked at the games and the way they play out more than a few times in the last couple of days. And there are times when I look at it, I'm like, this is something you should be able to do if you're a 170 test taker. This should not be something where it moves the scale. And then other times I'm like, I can see why that would cause a problem. I think the other set of games that was real also has a different type of debate around it. But I do think this was and I say this, again, reminding everybody that when I say it's easier, it doesn't mean it was easy. Just perhaps easier overall than the last one. This is the chess match, the band concerts in the parks, the geology professors, and then that kind of vicious tracing government secrets back to its source. This is also 23 questions. The argument here is that the first 3 games aren't as hard as the games in the prior section, but that the last game is maybe harder than all of them, of any of the other games. And so that kind of changes the nature or the dimensionality of the difficulty that is being proposed here. I personally don't think this is going to move the scale at 170. Their expectation is that you can do this, that even if the last game was difficult, that you had enough time on the first 3 games that you were able to then work through that last game. And I also know that there were a ton of people who were prepared for that last game because they'd seen the computer virus game. And I can't ignore that fact that I got tons of messages from people saying, like, that just made it so that it was certain that I crushed that.
Yeah. If that last game was truly novel, truly unique, then I would probably take a different stance on what I thought this would do to the curve than I will with this, where that last game has got such a clear like predecessor, such a clear almost like facsimile that most, if not almost all, 170 type of test takers will have done and understood. PT79 game for computer virus. If you have done that game before and you're a 170 type of scorer, then seeing this one about tracing a government secret doesn't present nearly the type of challenge that in isolation or in a vacuum it might appear to. And so that, to me, I think is where I would say this probably doesn't move the needle at 170. So I think you and I are actually in pretty close agreement on this.
I think we are. And someone might say, like, well, who cares if this is the second time they've used this idea? No, that actually makes a huge difference because they know that people prepare for the LSAT by doing prior tests. I mean, they have a whole product called Prep Plus that provides you with old tests precisely for this reason. Once they've used a really unique idea, there is a portion of the population, and that portion is higher in the 170 levels, who have seen it and now remember it and know how to actually deal with it. They have experience with it. So, yeah, back when they originally used that game about the computer virus, it was so hard that it certainly moved the scale. Now it's much more of a debate. I know it's moving the scale at 160. At 170, it's uncertain. And you can see how this discussion turns into a really interesting one. These two sections, neither one of them are easy. They're not tightening the scale, but they have different ways that they present the difficulty. And this just shows how different two people can have experiences where they have everything else is the same, but they have different logic games, and the way it impacts them can be dramatically different. The people who walked out and said, these are the hardest games I've ever done, I understand why they're thinking that. It makes sense that if the difficulty didn't hit them in the right way, that it would feel really like a terrible experience. I also understand why some people walked out and literally were laughing, saying, I just annihilated those games because they had a different experience and it hit them in a different way. No one's right, no one's wrong there, but the difficulty there, the estimation for me is that it's much more likely that the first section moves the scale than the second one.
Yeah, at least at the 170 level. You're going to get a
Yeah.
point or two of a break in the 150s from this government secret game. But I don't think you get the same sort of benefit up at the higher levels of this, which is where we're focusing.
Yeah, I'd say it's more in the 160s myself, but it's the same type of idea.
Yeah, I mean, downscale, basically. Yeah.
Exactly. Both sections are moving it downscale. So if you're in the 160s or 150s, that's good news for you. But overall, that means that you've got kind of a range of outcomes there. The RC and the LR were easy for us to assess on this test. Logic games and hopefully the nuance of that discussion, and you can see why I don't want this captured online with just like, oh, they said it didn't move the scale. I'm like, that's not what we said.
Yeah, I'll make one final point in this too. I mean, I'm sure it won't be final, but another point, which is one of the things we always encourage people to do is to consider their own experience as well. If the games that you saw this time felt harder than any games you've seen or felt harder than recent practice tests, compare those scales to what we're talking about, and you can make an informed decision. Dave and I didn't take this test. We're awfully good at assessing other people's experiences, but your experience matters too. So don't discount that in favor solely of what we're saying. Consider the entirety of it.
Exactly. You got to consider all options and assess them on your own. So that brings us to that kind of like that end of the discussion where really everyone is kind of like 7.5 to 9, you know, roughly in that range is where we would say, depending upon the specific sections. And hopefully you can narrow it down to the ones that you actually had to know more along the lines of what we're saying.
There you go. Is it going to get to -10 with any combination of this? Can't imagine. No. I could see a lot of -9s. Again, with the right type of games. I could see mostly people sitting at -8, though. I think the majority of these combinations give you a -8.
I think so. And then I think it loosens up a little bit more maybe than normal in the 160s, adds a question earlier, loosens it, so to speak, is the way I would probably describe a lot of the scenarios here. Not every single one, but a lot of them.
Yeah, so let me do this. I'm going to take that -8 test and -9 test. I made this promise to a couple people that I would do it. Let's talk a little downscale as to what some of this might look like. And I'll start with a -8. If you're at -8 based on what we just talked about, or think you're at -8 at a 170, here's what the 165, 160, and 155 scaling looks like for that combination of content. I think at a 165, you could probably miss 14 questions, so get 61 correct. And remember, everyone here had 75 scored questions. At a 160, I think you could miss 21 questions, so 54 correct. At a 155, I think you could miss 28 questions, so 47 correct. And let me do the same thing with the -9 test. So again, if you had that harder reading comp with the Blue Jays, if you had that harder section of games with the grants awarded to districts and feel like you got to a -9, here's the 165, 160, 155 for that test combination. I think at 165, you could miss 15, so 60 correct. A 160, I think you could miss 22, so 53 correct. And a 155, I imagine you could miss as many as 29 questions for 46 correct to get you to 155. Again, you can feel some of the softening down through the middle ranges that unfortunately doesn't quite apply at the high end, the very top.
Yeah, I think that is super useful. And again, all those minus numbers are questions missed to get those specific scores.
That's exactly right.
That's the easiest way for us to look at this is off the top. All right, well, that wraps up the scoring matrix discussion. Hopefully that helps clarify some things. Certainly, what's real, what's experimental, if you already weren't aware of that. If anybody has any questions about it, hit us on Twitter or wherever. We're always happy to try to talk about it to the extent that we can. Again, we're not going to get super detailed about any of the information because we've made the agreement not to do that. But we're all going to figure out what really happened on Wednesday, February 1st, around 9 a.m. Eastern time when they release these scores. And then hopefully it's good news. Recent score days have been very good overall. I hope this continues that trend.
Yeah, same here.
John, any final words?
Just one, I think. Unless champagne counts as a final word, then possibly two. What I was going to say is not only was it really gratifying, and we talked a lot about how accurate the crystal ball stuff was. We predicted literally half of the test to the exact content, and then gave recommendations for new content that would have saved people, and I know did, for what is arguably the weirdest and toughest of the 8 games that they saw. So I think across the board, this is about as A+ gold star, let's take a lap, as we could have hoped to be. We talk about this in terms of how well we did and our assessments and predictions and things, not to gloat so much or stroke our ego. We don't need it. But more to emphasize the fact of just how useful these resources that we provide to people are. They're free. We're giving them to you. We're telling you what to do to score better, to make your test day experience better. So please, going forward, whether you're preparing with us or elsewhere, take full advantage at least of the free resources that we put out there for you. You're doing yourself an immense disservice if you ignore what are inarguably valuable bits of information that we continue to provide. Agreed. So that may be as a next stage or step for people looking at the rest of the year. I think that's the thing I'd probably want to double down on or emphasize.
Yeah, and no one else is providing it. That's the other thing.
No one else could. No one else could.
Not competing views, not at the level that we're doing, because no one else has this database that is, 20 plus years now in the making. It's a huge advantage for us. It allows me to go back and say, oh, they first used this in 2007, and then they changed it in 2013. Then it was used as an experimental in 2018. You have to have history in order to be able to do that. That is the foundation of all that we do. But you use that thing and you're like, it's not a gloating thing. I think about it as accountability.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
How did we do? One of the things I see people often asking about is it useful? Is the crystal ball any good? And I often just shake my head because I'm like, they're clearly new to LSAT prep. And I'm like, that's one of the tough things is everybody who comes in, it's their first time. So they have to figure it out and learn it. But I'm always like, I wish there was just kind of a page that said, hey, it really is helpful. It sounds crazy that it would work this way. We agree that it is crazy that we can do this. That's why we've said we don't think it'll continue forever. But for now, you're in a golden age of LSAT knowledge. Why not take advantage of it? Because that age will close at some point. And you'll know that it's closed when they're like, when's that crystal ball? And we're like, we're not doing it. That day is coming. I don't know when. I don't think it's this year. I hope it's not this year. That would suck. But it will happen at some point. So we'll just, keep following us and we'll let you know what we're seeing each time we talk about it.
Yeah, ride the wave till it breaks.
All right, John, on that note, if anybody is not subscribed to this podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or a rating. And then send us any questions that you might have. You can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope this was helpful. We hope that you crushed that January LSAT. Stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon.